The new wave post-punk security hour continues. This time, we think of Nena and 99 Luft Balloons with the English lyrics, "Back at base, bugs in the software flash the message, something's out there." And since the song pretty much ends with cities in ruin, that seems like a good reminder to secure your code. Which means, this week we talk with Daniel Hampton from Fastly about the threats to APIs and some strategies for defending them. In the news segment, covert channels of not much consequence, a new protocol reaches confidence, bounties for product abuse and fraudulence, Amazon Sidewalks privacy competence, and more. Buy a bag of balloons and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. For teams looking to inject some security into the DevOps lifecycle, the Uptick Security Analytics platform offers complete security observability for your cloud workloads, including hosts, VMs, containers, and micro VMs. Uptick analyzes builds in development and at runtime for real-time detection of misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, and malicious behavior. Security Weekly listeners can sign up for a free 2-week trial by visiting securityweekly.com/upticks. Are you looking for a solution to protect your web apps against the most business-critical security vulnerabilities? Unleash the power of automated ethical hacker knowledge with Detectify for continuous coverage and relevant security vulnerability findings. Upgrade your web app security with speed and scale and start a 2-week free trial at securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself. Whether you need to manage bots, protect cloud applications at runtime, stop formjacking attacks, or secure your web applications and APIs, only Imperva offers a unified solution to protect from edge to application and data in one tool. Imperva helps you achieve more, save money, and become more efficient with fewer security vendors needed. Start a free trial today to easily protect your apps and website with Imperva. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
This is episode 153, recorded June 7th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Tyler Robinson. Hello, Tyler. Welcome aboard.
How you doing, Mike? Good to see you this morning, man.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining. Also here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hello, Mike.
That sounds just like you, John, and not at all like I'm filling in for when you join us later.
Thanks, Mike. Why don't you read the announcements now?
I will. Security Weekly is more than happy to announce that we will be at InfoSec World 2021 in person, October 25th through 27th. This year, our annual partnership with InfoSec World is extra special as we are both business units under the Cyber Risk Alliance brand. What does that mean for Security Weekly listeners and InfoSec World attendees? Well, you will get to see and hear from many of the Security Weekly team at the event, and you will save 20% off on your World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2021 to register using our discount code. Do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel, sign up for our mailing list, join our Discord server, and follow us on our newest live streaming platform, Twitch. Daniel is a senior solutions architect at Fastly, where he is responsible for assisting customers in the post-sales process by delivering a pragmatic and effective application security experience. Daniel recently joined Fastly through the Signal Sciences acquisition. He has spent a total of 16 years in the enterprise security space, covering database, web application, and container security, policy management, and managed services for small to medium businesses. Hello, Daniel. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
So we're happy to have you here, especially, as I mentioned, to talk about API security. And first, when I look at API security or immediately think of API security, we have the OWASP top 10 for the web, but we also have an OWASP top 10 for API. And there's kind of a lot of overlap, but we have two unique lists, two different lists for them. And so maybe let's kick off a little bit about just talking a little bit of the differences between what does an API bring to the table that we need to worry about? Or maybe what makes API security a little bit more unique than just worry about the web in general?
Yeah, I think it is worth highlighting the differences, but I think more important than anything else, it's notable that most of the top 10 and any security threats in general, for that matter, are overlapping because at its basic function, an API is a web application of sorts. The only differences really are what it's used for, how it's used, and then some of the challenges with implementing security controls that we don't necessarily have with web applications. So, not sure where you want to focus first.
Well, I think you make a good point that web applications are definitely built on top of APIs. So everything's kind of an API, but maybe it's more the fact that some APIs are more mature than others in the sense of their design and what they're handling. Here I'm starting to go into the ideas of REST and the contracts that they may have. But these are some of the design perspectives. But on the security perspective, there's certain tools that you can't necessarily do the same with an API that you might with a web app. And here I'm starting to get to things like authentication. Where you can't really throw a CAPTCHA in front of an API, especially from a B2B API, or if you're connecting services to each other. So already we're starting to get into a little bit of this idea of, well, how do you prove identity between APIs? But then there's also just the aspect of there's so much traffic going into APIs. And it's, on the one hand, that's good. That's what the APIs are designed for. But on the other hand, that's where the abuse comes from. And I'm kind of leading us down the line to talk maybe less about the idea of cross-site scripting and SQL injection and more of what does abuse of an API look like that might be different or unexpected for a development team who's just used to, quote unquote, the web, or not as necessarily as focused on that business logic maybe.
Yeah, and which also presents with an interesting question. So when people ask, how do we secure an API versus a traditional web application, the methodology is very, very similar. You have to know what the web application is being used for. You have to profile the activity. You have to understand what is expected versus what people are doing. And then you also have to understand what the business wants to allow for that web application. The same methodology holds for an API. If you don't know, and a lot of the time security teams really struggle with knowing this because they don't have direct linkages to the development team. If you don't know what an API is being used for, it's going to be a major challenge to actually protect it, because you have to, at the base level, profile the activity that's hitting an API to effectively secure it, because you can't throw in as you said, a CAPTCHA, or more effectively a multi-factor auth type situation to prove identity or to manage the identity of whoever is hitting the application. And that is one of the major challenges, which is where a lot of rate limiting comes into play, and a lot of, this is the sort of activity we want to allow to hit our application. Everything else we don't, which is another challenge, because you're not really required to send anything, right? If I just want to curl an API, or I want to hit it with a web browser, whatever, I can do that, unless there is a control in place that is saying I can't. So building controls like that is generally an approach that is a little different from a standard web application. But again, the methodology has direct overlap.
Does that methodology or the security concerns need to be taken into account prior to the deployment or during the development lifecycle in order to properly get APIs secured? Or can this be done post-development?
So both. Ideally, the answer is yes. It'd be great if during the development process, developers were to say, you know what, here's some things that we can do to document and sort of fingerprint what our API activity, anticipated activity, is supposed to look like, and then pass that information along to the security team so that the security team can use whatever controls they have in place, or acquire a security control that will allow them to permit certain activity. Because, right, if you look at how firewalls are traditionally implemented, not thinking web application firewalls, just a firewall, security, just a network firewall. ideally, you whitelist or allow list activity. You permit certain types of activity. You don't worry about blocking stuff. You think, this is the sort of activity we want to permit. Everything else is blocked by default. If you could do that with a web application or an API, that'd be great. But it's really a challenge because you have to know what is being done, what the application was designed to do. And then users have a tendency to show us interesting ways that our applications can be used. And APIs are no different. We've got a lot of challenges where we'll have an API, say, that validates credit cards, or that shows us a bunch, say, enumerates a bunch of store locations for a specific locale, right? We don't really anticipate that people might go, all right, I can use this to validate this massive stolen list of credit cards that I have, or potentially do the same thing with, say, stealing an entire list of, what a search engine is going to be enumerating to populate something else, a storefront somewhere else, add a middleman, purchase tickets, all these things.
I love the credit card example because to me that stands out as you have an API that's actually pretty well defined for the payload that it's expecting. Basically, 16 or so digits, maybe a expiration date, maybe a CVV, depending on the what it's supporting. So you can say, well, we're just looking for numbers essentially, and you can avoid that whole aspect of all the SQL injection, blah blah blah, all those attacks. But you pointed out that if somebody has that group of stolen credit cards and they're abusing that endpoint to enumerate and say they need to figure out what the proper expiration date is for a card or what that CVV is for a card, if they can just hammer that endpoint until they get that HTTP 200 response instead of some other error, that's a great use case for the attacker, and that's just abusing the product. And I think that's too where you're starting to get that idea of here's where the rate limiting can come in as to be a defense. So I'm curious, as you start to talk about this, how have you seen either like the security teams talk with their developers or vice versa, and sort of that threat modeling in the sense of what's the business context of your application and how can rate limiting or what help here, or what are really the sensitive workflows? How do developers and security teams identify these areas?
Exactly. So I like what you just brought up there. This brings up a significant challenge, and it kind of goes into what Tyler was talking about a second ago. If you know that an API is going to be well defined, like in the example we just gave, you can do a variety of things to secure it on the development side. But it isn't really, and we talked about this a little bit before, you can't put all these impetus for security and controls on the development team. It just doesn't work well. It's not what they're there to do. They're there to build an application and say, all right, this is serving whatever function the business needs it to do. It's ideal if you can bake security into it, but realistically, it's the security team's job, if you can, segment it out that way, to implement any controls that are needed. And if you build this application and you say, well, we're not going to give any generic, we're not going to give any specific response codes or any specific responses, but you could potentially have some information that says this credit card or whatever it is, whatever type of data you're trying to enumerate there, we're going to respond with something on the application side that's invisible to the client, and we can use it on our load balancer, or we can use it on our WAF or somewhere. We can strip it going back to the end user, but we have that to leverage when we're trying to determine the reason why something is happening. And you can take those and build pretty good security controls out of them. But it's
now, is that where
done.
Conditional rules? Is that where the conditional rules and some of the more advanced features for a little bit more sophisticated WAFs come into play?
Yes, exactly. So what we're talking about there is not necessarily IP-based rate limits that you can put into play, or
we all know those work, right?
Say what now?
Because we all know those don't work, right?
Yeah, you can try, but ultimately people figured out pretty good ways to get around those. And if it's only IP based, you're going to struggle. You've got to add something like IP plus header, IP plus something, key value pairs in the body, whatever, to make it a little bit more, or cookie value, for example.
So then that does lead to that question of how do you model a good rate limiting? Because there's one thing, do I just say, I don't want this to get hit more than 1,000 times a second, regardless from one IP or many IPs? Because there's also, of course, the dangers of a self-induced denial of service from misconfiguring a good rate limit. So there's that aspect, but there's also figuring out what's the behavior of the traffic. I think that's kind of what you're getting to there, beyond just based on IP addresses. So what are some good ways that you can set up that analysis to start looking for behavior? And is that something that can be done in the application itself? Is it something you have to do more at the traffic layer? Who ends up being responsible for that kind of work, I think, is also where I'm going with that.
Yeah, it's really well put. You definitely have the right way, if we were to use it, if we were to define it that way, to implement a rate limit, and definitely a bad way to do it. Just to arbitrarily say, well, we think maybe 1,000 or 500. Let's just go ahead. Let's go with that number and put it in front. And people have done that. And in the case of a reactive security plan where we have a team that says, oh, shoot, our endpoint's being used this way right now, and it's causing major problems, we have to throw something in front of it. You can't really take a measured approach. You have to say, well, let's pick this number and hope it doesn't break things, but already things are in a broken state because of a DOS that's happening, right? So we're gonna choose a number like that. You sometimes have no choice other than to do it that way. But ideally, what you've done is proactively built rate limits in to your API, and the right way to do that is a couple of things we got in place that we can build out a methodology around it. It's ideal to have lower environments that you can play with, but ultimately you are going to have to look at production level traffic, because again, we're not sure what we need to rate limit until there's something hitting us. And once we see that traffic and we can profile it a little bit and say, all right, well, this looks like it's above board. This is normal traffic. Then we have a couple outliers over here. And then we see that there's potential for abuse here. If we can define a couple of those things simply by looking at the traffic before we're in the middle of the thick of an attack, that's very nice. Then another thing that we can do is take one of the lower environments and actually build out, say, a load testing script, for example, and put some of the traffic that we're looking to rate limit into that, and test our rate limits before we roll them necessarily into production. But again, implementing a rate limit in production is kind of how you're going to have to do it. And if you have a tool in place that allows you to simulate a block, most WAFs and next-gen WAFs will allow you to have a logging mode or a non-blocking mode where you can indeed see that something would have been rate limited if a threshold was breached, instead of just directly rate limiting it. You can do it that way. So you build things and you take an arbitrary threshold like we just talked about, and we ratchet it down a little bit, and we see what happens if we ratchet that level down to a level that's ideal for us. And ideally, you're not doing it, again, based on just an IP. You're doing it based on a very specific set of criteria. Once you have that in place, you want to get as specific as you can and not rate limit anything that is outside of your use case. Yeah. And if you can do that, that's good approach.
Does APIs provide a little bit different challenge where there are a lot of things you may not consider that are going to be programmatically interacting with the web application, where something like users, they may be slower, they may be interacting in a certain manner. Programmatically, developers, even outside of your company may interact with your API very differently, and they may have a different approach in how they do those interactions. So is there kind of a different approach you must take from an API standpoint? And then to kind of follow that, as you're learning to secure the APIs, how do you go about learning API security versus web application security? A lot of people don't really understand the API level, and so really getting a grasp on what those differences are and how to go about learning more about API security versus just their web application security.
Yeah, so you bring up a couple interesting points there. So first of all, OWASP is great. It's a good starting point. If you take a look at the top 10 there and you start just going through the list and saying, all right, are we covered here? Are we covered here? A lot of the time working for a vendor, right, we get security questionnaires from our customers asking for us to give them, do we cover this OWASP top 10 list? And they want to know how we do it. You can go through that and do exactly that for your vendor. See what their response is. Hopefully they have one, and then you can see how well you have implemented some of the recommendations that they've got. Another situation though that you brought up was the challenges involved when you've got an API. I mean, if you've got a web application, you pretty much expect web browsers to be hitting it. So you can look at things like user agents and not all the time, of course, that's an optional header, but you can see basically what's being done over a web browser, and then you can see some of the things that are being done outside of a web browser based on user agent or absence of user agent or a handful of other things. An API is similar. If you have on the development side, a lot of what I've seen, it could be hit or miss. It's one way or the other. Either a dev team has said, here are the user agents that we're going to use. Here's what they look like. And this is a known user agent hitting the API. So you can profile based on the known activity. Then you can take anything else that's outside of that, look at it and say, all right, well, we're not sure who this is. This isn't an open API. Anybody could be hitting this. And we have a lot of unknowns when it comes to vendors hitting us, but our known activity is the stuff we want to look at. So again, the profiling aspect of things. If you take a look at your knowns, then you can go through the unknowns and categorize them in terms of different types of behaviors, and you can decide what you want to allow. Some of that it's a little bit of trial and error when it comes to implementing controls. You do your best to try to make sure you're not going to be stopping legitimate activity, but when you're building these things, it can be tough. And if you're, again, doing reactive security and building things to try to solve for an attack, you're going to have a lot more in the way of vendor feedback loops that are necessary to make sure that you're not breaking things long-term for people while you're trying to stop an immediate problem. Ideally, though, with proactive security, you have a whole lot less of that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you're describing too is just that in the spirit of raising the attacker cost, in the sense of it's really easy to shed off a lot of traffic that's just coming from a bash script around curl or something that's been cribbed together to enumerate against an API, because it just doesn't look like authentic traffic. As you're saying, it just needs some particular headers, or it just has a different profile to it. So I do want to shift us back or kind of pick up one of the things we were talking about from the types of attack angle, in the sense of attackers, will have to raise their costs, start to impersonate more legitimate traffic, authentic traffic, but they're still going to be enumerating this data. And you hit a little bit of it just talking about carding and testing a credit card endpoint. I'm curious, do you have some advice or some ways that, some seeds of conversation that a security team could take to developers to start talking about, these are some interesting and perhaps some unique threats to APIs, or here's some different ways that attackers might be trying to enumerate data because of APIs. Just trying to figure out what can be helpful to kind of kickstart that type of conversation around where are the sensitive areas in our app that we should be applying this type of rate limiting and traffic profiling to.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that is, I think, most useful to this discussion is figuring out how to open up these communication channels and figure out how to bake API or web application security into a product before it goes live, or to make some changes after it has gone live. And that has to involve a conversation between the security and the development teams. So again, you take a list like OWASP and you say, hey, here's some of the things that we've seen. We need to know a little bit more about what this API is intended for. And we understand that you on the development side are you're building this for a purpose. Could you please provide us a little bit of insight into that? And by the way, here's the list of the things that we're looking for. These are some use cases that we have seen. Provide a couple a couple examples of what we've seen in the wild. And OWASP has a lot of those. We've got a lot of those. There's stuff all over the web that provides a lot of good resources for how attackers are hitting different things. And if we can provide a concise list, because developers are busy, security teams are incredibly overworked, over alerted, over busy, all these things. If we can build something that's canned, concise, and helpful and understandable to our dev teams, generally they are willing to help us a little bit, maybe provide that header that has some information that we can use in our security tool, right? With that additional context for why a failure is taking place, so that we can build a rate limit into it. There's all kinds of stuff that can be done there, but communication is key for that.
No, clearly. I'm curious too, then, we're talking about, like, you went through a lot of the resources from OWASP, resources known about types of attacks against webs, against APIs. Are there some false assumptions, though? Maybe, we don't necessarily need to go back and restart everything from first principles, but as a security team or developers are coming to a security team to say, to close that gap between, we need some type of protection for this API, are there certain assumptions that they should avoid, or certain types of conversations they could skip over because they don't apply to an API when they might have been thinking this is how we did things 10 years ago, but the modern approach has moved on from that and we're doing something different?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. I think that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I've had a lot of conversations with teams recently that say they don't need to worry about OWASP injection type attacks in their APIs. And I think that's pretty naive, because when you have an API that you build out, yes, you'd like to think that your dev team has considered these things when they built it, and they've done a lot of testing and stuff like that. But you don't know what you don't know. And assuming that your API is protected against OWASP injection, cross-site scripting, any of these normal traditional attacks that we've seen and are protecting our web applications against, aren't going to be present in APIs. I think that doesn't work, and it muddies the water a lot. Also, even if your application isn't vulnerable, it doesn't mean attackers aren't going to try. And if you don't have a control in place that is going to let you know that they're trying, then you're missing out on some valuable information, because it can let you know. We talked about identity at the very beginning. It can let you know that someone or something, some type of behavior, is an attacker trying to do something. Then it can allow you to watch them or redirect them to a honeypot and then watch them in a little more constrained environment. There's all kinds of things that you can do.
Yeah.
Speaking of not knowing what your
go ahead, Tyler. Yeah.
I said, speaking of not knowing what your application may do when attackers are trying interesting things against your API, that's insight A that you should have, because that is valuable to you. But you may not understand what's going on and why your application is freaking out, because we get a little bit creative sometimes, and half the time, I would say, the stuff that scans you out on the internet and the interesting things hitting your API, they're probably not well thought through, and they're probably not very targeted. So let's see what your application is going to end up handling.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of the time. I'm sorry. And Mike, I think you had something else to add there.
No, well, I was going to say too, and maybe this ties into, I think, to Tyler's comment as well. I want to poke a little bit at the you in how you were describing that, because you already brought up once, it's important to have the conversation between security and developers. I think everybody agrees to that. And I'm kind of curious too, especially when Tyler's pointing out, there's a lot of attacks that are just possibly the shotgun approach, just attacks being spread randomly against targets. And the idea of you want to know what's going on with your app. How have you seen, or who is the you in those sorts of scenarios, or what are the successful ways to make either the you in that scenario the security team that's doing the monitoring, or even for that matter, perhaps the developer or the ops team that's actually operating this type of tool and taking the feedback from the tool and tweaking their application against it, let alone just tweaking kind of the countermeasures within the tool itself?
Yes, exactly. So that's where that conversation can start, is if you already have, say you have an API that's in place and you have a tool like Fastly or Signal Sciences WAF, you throw it in front of an API because of some kind of mandate, right, that comes down, or just because you're interested. You want to see what happens. You want to see what activity you have, what visibility you can gain. When you put that in front, a lot of the information that you get is going to require some context that only the dev side of the house is going to have, and visibility that only the security side of the house is going to have based on the implementation of their tools. If the security team's looking at some of the traffic that's coming in and just going, I have no idea what this is, but it's interesting. It's interesting to me. Why are we getting these response codes? Why are we seeing this level of traffic coming in? Maybe there's, like in the case of Signal Sciences, we have a lot of anomalous signals that we provide.
Mm-hmm.
There's stuff that we think might be interesting. We don't know if it is. It could just be boring in a specific context, but in other situations, it's very interesting. If you see a lot of that stuff, you might want to rope in your dev team and say, hey, by the way, we're seeing a truckload of 500s or 400s hitting when this sort of activity takes place. Are you aware of this? Is this something that is expected, or do we want to take a little bit of a closer look? And the dev team might take a look at it and say, wait a minute, we need to make a change here. Oh, hey, look, there's a password over here that needs to be updated, and this is actually legit activity. It's just the password's bad. We need to change it. There's all kinds of things that can be gained with that level of communication. And if you can give maybe a dashboard view of specific types of information from a security tool to a dev team and give them that level of access, or you can pull it into maybe their logging tool that they're already using. Maybe they have access logs they're gathering.
Yeah.
You can contextualize things a lot better for them and let them respond in ways that the security team alone couldn't do.
Yeah, I love that idea, because the phrase, that's interesting, I think has led to many a very successful penetration test, or a lot of consequential CVEs have been the result of such a phrase.
Yes.
And you're also pointing out, too, is that one of the things that we've harped on in the past, or we've encouraged in the past, is application layer logging, meaning logs generated by the application. But that takes time to generate, to build those logs, to code what should we log, what should we be doing. And that really resonated with me when you said just that idea of, why are we getting these 400s? Should that happen? That sounds like a great way just to start talking about the application, because it doesn't even necessarily lead to a vulnerability that's being exploited or explored. It could just be a quality issue within the application. And that, to me, already sounds like a value benefit to the developers, and a great way to build that rapport with them from the security team.
You nailed it. Rapport is key there. And I see a lot of the time there's adversity between different teams and security, and that should never be. It should always be, we are very clearly on the security side of things serving the needs of the business in such a way that they can see tangible benefit to the things that we're asking them to do and the tools that we're asking to put in front of their stuff. If we're not providing them with some insight, we should be looking for ways to do that so that they can understand that we're not just trying to get in the way of things. We're not trying to slow stuff down unless it's an attacker, and we're trying to enhance availability and performance of an application, not just, lock the doors.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I do want to thank you for coming and sharing your insights with us. And the only thing getting in between us and continuing is time limits. So we'll have to figure that out. So we've been rate limited somehow already. But I want to thank you again for joining us and sharing your insights about API security.
Right on, Mike. My pleasure. Thanks, Tyler.
Cool. I also want to thank Tyler for joining us and everybody who was asking questions in the Discord. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.
When it comes to web app and API security, the choice is simple. You can choose Fastly's security solution that teams will actually use in full blocking mode, just like 90% of their customers. Or you can stick with costly options that you probably just turn off. You can get Fastly's all-in-one platform that protects apps everywhere they live, however they're built. Or departments can agree to disagree. You can go to securityweekly.com/Fastly to learn more. Or you can just wish you had. DisruptOps helps you find and fix cloud security issues fast. Getting bombarded with irrelevant alerts is frustrating. DisruptOps gives security and DevOps teams prioritized findings and routes relevant alerts to Slack or Microsoft Teams with automated response options that save you time. Finally, security is inside your workflow instead of in your way. Listeners can access the full platform free for 30 days by visiting securityweekly.com/DisruptOps. Looking to improve your web application security? Probly is reinventing web application security. Probly focuses on the vulnerabilities that matter, eliminates false positives with evidence-based scanning, and provides a simple point-and-shoot solution that is easy to use. Probly's thorough coverage ensures accurate identification of vulnerabilities in any modern web application or API. Improve your web application security processes by visiting securityweekly.com/Probly and start your free trial today. We discuss application security a lot on this show, and we know that the implications for code security have become even greater as cloud adoption accelerates software development. Shift Left bridges the gap between security teams and developers to find and fix vulnerabilities accurately from the source. Shift Left Core is an innovation in code security with industry-leading accuracy and speed. It combines next-generation static code analysis, intelligent software composition analysis, secrets detection, security insights, and contextual developer security education in one easy-to-use platform. Learn more and create your free account at securityweekly.com/shiftleft.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Tyler Robinson and John Kinsella. Security Weekly is ecstatic to announce that Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista in Florida. Call for presentations and early registration for Security Weekly listeners is open now. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to submit your presentation and grab an early registration price before it expires. Join us on June 10th at 11 a.m. Eastern for our technical training on insider risk to learn how to quickly mitigate data exposure risks. Then join us June 24th at 11 a.m. Eastern to learn how web application firewalls can help mitigate exposure in a complex threat landscape. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to register now. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And now we do actually have John Kinsella joining us this time. John, I mentioned it in our last segment. I don't think anybody noticed that that you were missed.
I saw some comments in Discord. I'm offended that people were excited to have Tyler here. No, seriously, glad to have Tyler here. It's always fun to have him around.
Glad to have Tyler here. Glad to have you here. And because we have quite a bit of news to go through. And one sort of, we'll maybe set the tone of a branded vulnerability. And this is one that I saw, but I think you beat me to the punch, John, about throwing it onto our show notes this week about miracles that would happen with the M1 chip on Apple.
Yeah. It was funny. I was worried that I wasn't going to remember this one after we had the week off and what it actually was about, but I'm actually remembering it. So this is it's an interesting little one. I don't know how this. I'd be curious to hear a story about how this one got through the loops. It's not really something we're going to be worried about people, at least yet, being able to actively exploit and do something interesting with. But long story short, let me talk about what it is before we keep yapping about the story around it. On an ARM CPU, on the M1s, and I think also the A11, there's a weakness where they've got some protected registries. They're like 2-bit registries, like not trying to make a joke, it's a 2-bit registry, but the registry is designed to be used by really the administrative processes on that CPU, right? Modern CPUs have got different levels for, what's going on, who has access to what. But with this one, it was found out that could be accessed from outside of that. From a non-privileged level. So that basically would allow you to provide message passing between applications when it wasn't intended. So that's the issue. It's not something you can do like, an O-day remote attack and start like, stealing all the information. It sounds like it's sort of a slow pipe too, since it's 2-bit. But, Miracle, blah, blah. What was interesting to me is just the name of the register, S3_5_C15_C10_1.
Rolls off the tongue.
I guess whoever created the miracles, they need to go and work for Apple and start giving them better names on their registers, I guess.
Yeah, this was the write-up was the more interesting part of this than the actual vuln itself, because the vuln, as you said, is really just a covert channel that technically does break a security boundary, but it's two unrelated processes that could talk to each other through this basically bit flipping. And so, nothing really big there. The write-up does kind of point out, it does conjecture that it could be used for user tracking or collusion between things like applications that are trying to do lots of user profiling. So maybe there's some type of remote risk scenario out there, but not a big deal. It is, we did throw it in there too because it's an entertaining write-up, and the author does do a little bit of railing against the hyping and naming of vulnerabilities. Which in this case, I'm always up for a good satire, and I would have loved even more punch if this was something named like MIME or something like that, M1ME, and didn't even have an underlying vuln beneath it, but had something else that was sort of why are we talking about this at all? And that poking fun at overhyped vulnerabilities. But in this case, legit vuln, pretty legit write-up in the sense there's a good technical aspect of hypervisors, what different hypervisors are, and so on. So worth a good read, some good entertainment there. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, it just goes to show that the M1 is definitely getting some attention with the vulnerability community and what they're looking for. 2-bits is nothing to really write home about, and that's really hard to exploit. But we start to think about some of the side channel attacks and the kind of implications of the fact that there is the ability to do this. And, it's only 2-bits this time, but with people looking at it, that doesn't mean that the next one can kind of scoot underneath of the sheets.
Yeah, and I think you're quite right. A lot of the researchers are going to be focusing on where are the oracles that are going to leak information about either CPU state or internal kernel state, and that's what's going to get more consequential in the sense of cryptographic keys, especially anything around the trusted enclave or the trusted store. And similar to like how Intel's SGX has been poked apart and for all sorts of security reasons, so that it could attackers wanting to leak as much information as possible about what kind of key material or other secret material has been stored in there. So this will not be the first and only time we talk about M1 over the next year, I'm quite sure. Another thing that I think we'll be talking about over the year is protocols. This was pretty neat. It stood out on my radar because I love protocols, and this is about Quick, RFC 9000, which for those of you who've watched 2001: A Space Odyssey and HAL 9000, we probably should be naming things 9000s just because of how they turn out, but that's a discussion for a different time. But in this case, it is a new protocol for HTTP 3 that will be layered on top of it. So it's basically some fancy UDP framing with with encryption built in, similar to the TLS 1.3 handshake, and a lot of great performance improvements that can come to the HTTP protocol, something that has been around for 30 years or so, and actually hasn't seen much innovation other than HTTP 2 that came out a couple years ago, but still isn't quite pervasive. So there's a couple other things to me that stood out that I wanted to talk about this, but I'm not sure if Tyler or John, if you guys are the protocol heads that I am and enjoy this. Oh, yep. That's the answer right there. So this is okay, John. All right, you said something. I'll throw it over to you.
I noticed this started popping up. We have those few articles around this that sort of came out, right? And I started noticing outbound traffic on one of my firewalls. And I was wondering if like something changed and they actually started using this more frequently, but I think it was just a timing type thing. But yeah, you dug into this one deeper than we did, I think.
The other aspect I wanted to bring out of this too is that great, we have a new protocol. Fine, we'll see some hopefully not design flaws in it, but probably some implementation mistakes. But one of the things I did pull out was Cloudflare, for example, has an open source implementation of Quick called Quiche. And what stood out to me for this is that they chose to implement it in Rust. So here we're starting to see the new internet, so to speak, with protocols that actually have a dedicated section called design or security considerations in it. So go to the RFC, check out section 21, and there they actually have a nice discussion about what are the on-path, off-path attackers can do. In other words, things like intermediation attacks, spoofing attacks. It's because it's UDP-based, they already have some considerations around anti-amplification, getting in front of things like request forgery attacks, even things like other denial of service, like what they call stream commitments. Think of these like TCP SYN floods or old school TCB exhaustion, tables, or even just slow Loris attacks. So what's nice is that the protocol has actually built on the history of design weaknesses and flaws that have come up over the past decades or so, and they've thrown that into the RFC as first principle considerations. The other thing now, too, is I'm circling back to that Rust mention, is that Rust will potentially see fewer of those memory and buffer and boundary overflow conditions within these implementations. So any type of protocol with framing can have fragmentation or framing, intentionally misframed items in the way that a adversarial client is trying to send traffic to a server. So I'm just kind of mentioning that as kind of a cool meta conversation, if you will, about just implementation decisions for teams choosing to say we were going to implement this in Rust rather than continue perhaps the sins of the past in C. So that is my long way of saying that, yes, there can be something here that's interesting and relevant to application security. Tyler, take it away.
I think this is a great kind of point that is going to be coming up more and more as we start to see some of these new RFCs, some of these new developments, right, where development teams are going to look at and consider maybe the C application they've been using and having to fix, use after free bugs for the last 10 years. They're going to start taking into consideration, we're going to start seeing a lot of security impact around full redesigns where they're using maybe a more modern framework like Rust and some of these new protocols that are going to be leveraged not only by the application and take advantage of some of the security and performance things, but also at the edge when you start to talk about things like CDNs and their ability to pass traffic or prioritize things, or even some of the more advanced features for APIs and WAFs, like we talked on the last segment. Fastly's got a whole thing with Quick's RFC that they've put out for a blog. So I think there's a ton of value in what is going to happen from a security standpoint, just from the bleed off benefit of adopting and seeing the adoption of newer technologies for perhaps performance or features that they're going to start using.
Yeah, and I think that kind of like the Rust plus boring SSL, these are forward-thinking design choices rather than a C-based implementation plus cranky old OpenSSL. I pulled in another article just briefly, mostly because I loved the title of it, which was, what was it? TLS session caching disaster. And this is not really that big a deal, honestly. It's a vulnerability that could potentially lead to an RCE within curl, but pointed out just for couple of reasons. One, Daniel Stenberg also had a great write-up and a link to some great background information on HTTP3. So I encourage listeners, if you're interested in that, in the new protocol, go check out his links and the documentation that he's developed over the 3 or 4 years as he's been watching Quick and HTTP3 evolve. But the other thing too is that curl is clearly a well-regarded, well-loved, well-maintained, and honestly high-quality software. And yet, Tyler, to your point, it's still running into the occasional memory unsafety issues. And this is something that has lots of developers, a dedicated maintainer who's curated it for quite a long. I think it's 15 years old. I can't quite remember, but well over a decade, and still running into a couple mistakes. So this is not in the sense of blame the developer. It's more of even great developers are going to make these types of C language mistakes and have these types of vulnerabilities come up.
How long do you think it's going to take for the adoption of some of these kind of new protocols? There's a lot of applications out there that haven't even taken up some of the HTTP2 adoption. So we're already on 3 here, and we're getting an RFC. But do you see that being widely and quickly adopted? Are we starting to see a progression in adoption happening faster, or is it still kind of the same old thing?
Well, I already appreciate that you used quickly adopted, whether the pun was intentional or not. But I will say that clearly the browsers are the front runners here, and the iOS and Android, because these are small developer ecosystems in the sense of Google, Android, Firefox, that are working on to bring in protocol support. But I think, to your point, the uptake is going to be a lot slower. And unfortunately, the reason I say that is if we look at the TLS 1.0, 1.1 deprecation just to get onto TLS 1.2, it took a really long time. We do have maybe some benefits with, as call back to our last segment, with CDNs like Fastly, Cloudflare, et cetera, Akamai, which we have an article on them as well, who can give you that edge-based TLS 1.3 or that edge-based quick support. But if your backhaul is going back down to HTTP 1, that's not really as great of a benefit necessarily. So it's going to be slow because it's the clients are out there ready, but the servers need to come on. And I think the one other thing that stands out to me is I'm curious from the pen testing aspect, how are these more framed protocols like HTTP2, HTTP3 going to make it more difficult for, honestly, what was back in the day a very easy protocol just to pick apart because it was so plain text and human readable?
From my standpoint, when I do pen tests, I probably do it a little different than a lot of places. I typically am abusing whatever function is being used within the application anyway. So I'm trying to mimic and or abuse the product in the way it was designed to be used. And thus, encryptions, protocols, adoptions of those things typically don't have the same ramifications. And that being said, we're always looking for some of the traditional things to, abuse authentication or some business logic inside of how the applications are handling things. But again, a lot of that doesn't really get affected by the protocol or doesn't deter the attacker. So I think it's a combination. We don't want any of the old attacks or any of the denial of service or simple bypasses, use after free exploits. Like those things are kind of all common. I think those are getting to be less and less. When they are found, they usually are pretty severe because it takes a lot of effort to find them, and thus they're probably very deeply buried within inside of a kernel somewhere. But I think the abuses and protections for the application at things like the API level, like we talked the last segment again, those abuses where attackers are using them for something like validating credit cards or for testing authentication, we're using the application in the way it was kind of designed to an extent. We're just abusing additional features or creative features that we think of that the application can do. And so I think that there's going to be the same level of effort from the development and the security team's collaboration in order to build and design and think of a lot of those attacks and preemptively plan on how to protect applications against those.
Yeah, I think I'm going to use that. I think that's a great segue into one of the articles that was unfortunately just kind of a little bit fluffy about Google announcing new abuse research grants program. And this ties, the reason I was using that as a segue is that this Google, for about the past 3 years, they actually created a bug bounty for product abuse. And I think that ties in quite nicely to what you were just describing just now, and a little bit of the conversation we were talking about with in the last segment with Daniel about enumerating data or carding attacks. And I highlighted this just in the sense of call it a reminder to listeners, whether on the security side, the DevOps side, that your threat models should also include how can that application be abused? Not so much in the sense of the technical aspects, but just what are the what are the aspects of it when someone like Tyler comes by and says, "Huh, that's interesting," and just seeing what the business logic happens to. And I threw in just two examples of what I mean by this in terms of the Twitter tip jar privacy fiasco and the Slack Connect DM potential abuse. So don't need to rehash those articles. They're a bit old, but I just wanted to throw out this product abuse, which is I think, a good reminder necessary on top of things like the OWASP Top 10.
Yeah, product abuse, I think, is much more prevalent than application vulnerabilities. Like, it's very rare that we use exploits. It's fairly rare that we break a web app in a traditional manner. It's much more common for us to find something like an API that allows me to write random data anonymously. Like, that's pretty useful. That's a C2 channel. That's a data exfil channel, especially if it's a trusted platform that is continuously used by a lot of places. There's those kind of things are ripe for abuse and will probably be abused very heavily. And you don't want that reputation damage. You don't want that extra load on your application. And really, you've got to make sure that your application is being utilized in the way that you designed it, because at the end of the day, you're paying for it. And the customers are expecting a level of effort and sanity on the data that they're using it for. So ensuring that those things are thought about. The abuse is, I think, a much more prevalent attacker base and attack surface that's going to have to be monitored more and more as we move forward.
Yeah, and speaking of reputation and product abuse, I linked to another article, Amazon Sidewalk. So they have a white paper on the privacy and security of their design. And this is similar in vein to the discussion you and I had, John, a couple weeks ago about Apple's AirTags. So here is a new product space that has, from the developer side, whether it's Apple or Amazon, some explanations of approaches to encryption, approaches to privacy protections, privacy preserving aspects, minimizing what metadata can be revealed. But definitely, where am I going with this? Oh, but the volume here is, we're talking about, like with iOS, perhaps 1 billion users. Talking with Amazon Sidewalk, everybody walking around outside covered areas. So the scale of this has definitely become quite different. And the approach to how Amazon wrote their security white paper here is definitely, it's informative, but it's definitely a little bit more on the technical wonky side, where they're describing essentially envelope encryption, a lot of different encryption keys to how they protect metadata and minimize what kind of information might be exposed. But there's still a lot of either misunderstanding as well as legitimate concern from an end user perspective about what does this mean to me and what's this impact to me from a larger ecosystem, since I'm going to be surrounded by these devices.
Yeah, sorry. I just we've been talking about this stuff, and people can guess my thoughts on it. But I'm just quickly scanning. I hadn't realized there was a white paper in here before that Amazon has, which sort of goes to what you're talking about, the envelope encryption and stuff like that. So I think for me, this is, I'm happy to say I've got no Amazon products in the house, so I have nothing to turn off on this one. And it's partially because of stuff like this, right? Think of this. I think the next analog that hasn't been mentioned on this one yet is when Comcast started doing this with their the cable modems, right? Allowing people to share Wi-Fi. Mm-hmm. And I think what's going to be interesting to sort of go a little back towards what Tyler was just talking about is not the direct usage, but can this allow you to basically use your neighbor's connection as a VPN somehow, right? What can you do to transfer traffic through this which wasn't intended, that allow you to be sort of covert in what you're doing? I think that's an interesting aspect of this. The thing itself, I think it's really similar to Apple, right? From that point of view of, it's a 40th of the bandwidth, I think, is the comment they make of an average video being streamed. So it's pretty low cost to the customer. It's more about having something you bought suddenly being used for a purpose completely outside of what you intended it for. So that, I think, is going to raise the hackles in a lot of people. But it'll be interesting to see how it goes, right? I mean, it's the use cases that they came up with. The one the ones I saw a week or two ago was something about being able to allow seniors to have better access for their, I don't know, pacemaker or some crap like that. It was they were definitely trying to sort of tug on some strings of the hearts, but yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Technically, I'm a big fan of mesh networks. I like Wi-Fi mesh and things like that. But I think for it itself, it'll be fun to see how people manipulate it. I think that's going to be the fun part.
The manipulation could be amazing, right? Like, I think the manipulation part of this is like what ends up bleeding out of this, what research hasn't been done, what air gaps haven't been jumped to get into your internal network from this. And then like the selfish side of me comes to the realization that no matter how this gets adopted, and like there's going to be limits and thresholds and things on this, but that still means that I'm sharing my internet, right? I'm very, very selfish when it comes to my internet. I like all the speed I can get. So regardless, I'm giving internet to strangers, and I'm providing them a pipe that's not going to change. Like Amazon doesn't control my ISP's pipe. So there's a portion of this that I pay for the internet, and I don't really feel like giving that internet access out and having someone else use my pipe, especially when I figure out how to abuse this pipe. Like that seems like a great covert channel that, I don't have to use my bandwidth for.
Yeah. And it's also, think about the way we're talking about this and Comcast. It's a very, at least I think to me initially, it's sort of an American concept of this is mine. I bought this for me. I don't want to share it with my neighbor. So it'll be interesting to see where this gets used around the world. Like, is it going to be used more in Europe, but they're going to be more concerned about privacy and GDPR. Asia, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. I doubt they're ever going to publish it, but I'd love to see a heat map of this in say like 18 months.
Yeah,
I think you're right there.
Some of the aspects I was thinking of this too is more on less about that data sharing or connection sharing, bandwidth usage essentially, but more about where is the tracking humans, where is the potential stalking for this, or just of these are the few metadata leaks, so I can see who is where as they transit through all these sidewalk potentially connected areas. The other reason I brought this up is that there is a communication aspect here that, to me at least, I think is interesting. And on the show, past episodes, we've tried to talk about this aspect of communication and communicating security, even though as I'm stumbling over and not being necessarily coherent as I describe this. But in the sense of, here's a white paper from Amazon, and Amazon loves their 3 different names for the same service. They love their acronyms, and this white paper is full of them. So it's a way that is not, it's not opaque to necessarily technical people who understand a lot of the terms being thrown about here. But if they're trying to get ahead of the, call it the reputational risk of what should I be worried about in this? This isn't necessarily the right way to reach the audience of the more general user who just has that Echo or whatever other device that might be part of this mesh network. And I thought that was kind of an interesting exercise that you could bring back to your own security team to figure out when we're talking about rolling out new requirements or rolling out new security, to either talking to our developers or talk about working with our product managers, and we're doing external marketing, external communication about the security features of our product. How are we communicating that in a way that is effective and presenting the threat and acknowledging the threat models that our users may have? And so now I'm going to have to poke Tyler and John to wake up from my interesting things and talk about communication and bring us back to some more technical things, perhaps. Real quick, before we run out of time, there was a small workshop that's very academic called a Workshop on Security and Human Behavior. And I threw a link to it, which was a link of almost 20 or 30 articles at the very least that were basically just background information about white papers that the developers presenting at this workshop had written about. And 3 I just wanted to highlight real quick. One was comparing the usability of cryptographic APIs. There was a PDF about security update labels, and putting security labels on IoT products. And there was another that was just talking about factors affecting the implementation of security and privacy practices in software development. And they're pretty meaty papers in the sense of, these are some academic PDFs to read through, but they're kind of interesting, I think, in the sense of reinforcing some common themes that we've talked about in the past. On the cryptographic APIs, they was basically emphasizing simplicity does promote security. They're looking at a couple different libraries and just saying, are they helping or are the APIs helping or hindering developers solving the problem they need to solve with encryption? As well, so you mean the other two
envelopes
articles.
Inside of envelopes of encryption is not a good thing?
envelopes with if you're starting to get confused by your API, and did the API do make a informed and opinionated choice for you that you understand, that's possibly good. But did it just do something, or was it easy to misuse the API is really what's going after there. And it was kind of pointing out, OpenSSL versus boring SSL versus 2 or 3 others. I think Tink was another one. And just saying, I want to use that. If you were a security team to go to a DevOps team and say, use envelope encryption for this solution, it's probably not a good idea to just walk away at that point, because yeah, sure, that might be a great recommendation, but the details of that implementation and how you're managing the keys, rotating the keys, what the different keys mean are pretty important. So I think there is one other article here that I pulled out as a postmortem from Akamai, talking about some things that might be familiar with Tyler, poking around just known vulnerabilities. This one was an example of, again, communicating from Akamai, a good transparent postmortem about they were pulling in Lasso, a third open source library that exposed what was a new type of attack, at least to me, XML signature wrapping, that was essentially just a mismatch between the signed data that an application verifies versus the unsigned data that the application pulls out of that XML blob and is using within their business logic. So just kind of an interesting write-up in the spirit of a new vuln. We've talked about some authentication bypasses, authentication problems in SAML in the past, so I just thought this one was a neat one to throw in there.
I think this one right here is going to highlight something that we've kind of talked about for a while, and something I've been harping on. People don't realize the level of risk that this potentially could expose. When you start to talk about all of the companies that have went SaaS and or SAML, right, or OAuth or whatever one you're going to throw in there, and then you start to talk about how much corporate data, IP, intellectual property, discussions, even just sensitive information from a company standpoint, all of these things and where they live and how you do the authentication, something like this where you're essentially wrapping the authentication with inside of requests. I mean, we've been doing this kind of for years with binary signing and certificates for signing binaries. There's ways to manipulate those and even have collisions for certain signatures. So the fact that this is now migrated out to SAML and to SaaS applications and authentication, I think this should highlight the fact that you really need to take care of how you do your authentication, what data you keep in SaaS applications, how you have an approach for visibility and monitoring of all of these disparate technologies and platforms, because they're going to be abused, and honestly, they've been being abused for a little while. So keep your eyes open and watch what's happening.
Indeed. And I think that, this is also not something, adopting SAML, adopting these types of mechanisms are great because we can hopefully improve just the ecosystem around just raw usernames and passwords. And yes, an application that's mishandling OAuth tokens is still putting users at risk the same way it might mishandle usernames and passwords. But at least hopefully that loss of an OAuth token is constraining the blast radius, if you will, of that exposure to that single application. And we're not putting the responsibility on salting, protecting all these new passwords onto applications that possibly don't have the maturity to handle them as securely as they should. So still a fan of these types of federated authentication systems. Just as you were pointing out, Tyler, there's a lot of nuances that need to be paid attention to. Did want to hit, as listeners may know, we definitely reach back into the history of the web, history of the internet. And I thought it was in June 2021 is 30 years after June 1991, when Tim Berners-Lee was working at CERN and was talking about the CERN HTTPD, basically the first HTTP server. So I thought that was a fun bit of trivia to help tie in and celebrate the HTTP 0.1, or it was 0.9. 0.1 was the version of the server and at the time in 1991, when today we're talking about HTTP 3 and the new protocol with Quick. So don't know if there's any fun trivia you want to throw around the history of the HTML or HTTP, but I thought I'd bring that into the conversation.
I was almost going to make a snarky joke about. I saw that in your items coming up, the 1991. I think the W3's page on that actually looks a little more up to date than one of the other pages. I don't want to cast shade at people, but some of the other articles we've covered today.
That's possibly very true. So this was our whirlwind through this week's news. Want to just give a chance. Was there something we might have missed? Anything that we want to throw in there, Tyler or John?
I wanted to cover one thing really briefly. For both for Mike and I, and for a lot of people out there, over the weekend, Philippe Courteau from Qualys passed away. He led the company for 20 years, I think. Huge. Great guy in the industry. All the stories you've heard about them are true. He's I didn't get to spend a ton of time around the guy, but I still spent enough. And he was a very interesting fellow to watch and closely. When Qualys picked up Layered Insight, the first question he asked me at a boardroom table, one of the only questions he asked me was like, "What do you know about Qualys?" And I'm like, "Well, I've been using you guys for years. You've been around since the 90s, blah, 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 blah." And he just nodded his head, good enough, and on we went. But great guy. Glad to get a chance to know him. I'm thoughts for all the Qualys family this week as they're dealing with that and moving forward. But just want to mention him. Thanks for mentioning that, John, too, because I spent 8 years at Qualys working on the web application scanner and worked quite a bit with Philippe on occasion. And this was the time, software as a service before software as a service was even coined. So definitely pioneering in the cloud and building up a great company and some great people that he worked with, that I worked with, that was around there. So will definitely be missed. And with that, I want to thank John for joining us. I want to thank Tyler as well for joining us this week. Thanks to everyone who's been quite active in chatting with us in the Discord channel. Thanks once again. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.